Meet you too. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so happy to speak with you. So, Shanda, you are a composer who's now worked on quite a bit of work in terms of film and television. So I'm curious about your work, but before we start, maybe just a bit of a rewind in terms of, how did you get into music? Was that something that you grew up with and kind of led you to this path?
Yeah, well, it's definitely that. It's something
Mhm.
I grew up with. So my mother's mother was a classical musician. She was a pianist and an opera singer, and I think she also composed a bit too, as well as one of my mother's other sisters did piano and composition. I started, piano was my first instrument.
Mhm.
I would assume like preschool sometime around that time. I know my
Right.
brother was a baby, so that's like, before
Yes.
kindergarten. Um, and then I started violin when I was 8,
Mm.
and started playing in orchestras, um, around that time. And then I started composing in middle school. So for my middle school orchestra, I would write tiny little pieces for my orchestra and like they would perform it and and yeah, I just never stopped composing since then. So,
Oh,
did the
wow.
whole thing, went to, undergrad for music theory and composition and violin performance. Those were my
Okay.
degrees. And then
Mhm.
I went to the USC film scoring program
Okay.
and then just stayed in LA and just made a
Yes.
path for myself. So
Yeah, amazing, amazing. So you were quite accomplished from early on, which is amazing to hear. And I think it's obviously part of the family, so it's not surprising in that sense that you've lived and breathed music since your
pretty
very
much.
early days.
Yeah, pretty much.
Um, so you know what? I know you study both composition and obviously as a musician to play in some of these with classical instruments. Um, what's that segue like into working? Because I'm sure you've done a lot of performing and you are very familiar with classical music, which a lot of us do love still.
Mhm.
What's that segue like into more of compositions for visuals like film and television?
Mhm. Um, Honestly, for me, it didn't feel like there was anything different.
Hmm.
It felt very, very natural, because one thing we have to remember in old Hollywood, a lot of classical composers were film composers, Dmitri
Right.
Shostakovich,
Hmm.
Korngold. And so, you know, like writing for a classical orchestra and putting that with visuals, it's just a very natural thing. And, I would say the hardest part is just, convincing other people that that's what you do, you know, and,
Right. Right.
because, I look like maybe a singer, and that was the
Oh, I see.
assumption, a
Mm,
lot of times. I would say like, oh, I'm a composer. And they're like, oh, do you write songs?
mm.
And it's like, no, not really. I write for the
Right.
trumpets that go do do do, and the violins go la la la. That's what I do. And they're like, oh,
It's
okay,
interesting, right?
question mark. But
Yeah, I'm
so
glad
yeah.
you share that because I think that's still something that needs discussion in terms of the assumptions that people make
Mhm.
when, you talk about being in music in some form or the other, and maybe people assume one role instead of the other. I'm always happy to see women in those roles of composing, which we need to see more of. And
Exactly.
I know
Exactly.
we're
Agreed.
seeing more nowadays, which is
Yes.
great. So yeah, it's amazing to see more women in the field of composing and leading orchestra, which I always enjoyed live too. It's just the
Absolutely.
energy that women bring to the forefront. So in terms of working for composing film and television, do you have a preference on whether you have visuals already for the film that you may be composing, or maybe you're kind of brought in earlier in the process, so it's not quite film yet? Any preference or any changes in how you would work on the compositions?
I do believe it depends on the script.
Mm,
So, like, for example, for Devotion, I came on very early in the script
okay.
stage.
Mhm.
And the script actually inspired me so much. I actually wrote one of the main themes to the
Mhm.
script before I saw any visuals.
Oh, nice.
Um,
Mhm.
you know, but then there are other films that are very, very visual, like you need the visuals to
Okay.
be able to get the juices running, to get the
Of
ideas
course.
first. So it can go either way. It just depends on project, depends on the collaborative team, depends on how, soon they bring you on. Because a lot of times,
That's true.
you're the very, very last step, and you have
Right.
like 14 days to get
Oh
it
my
all
goodness.
done. So sometimes that happens.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, it varies.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Devotion because that is the film we're going to be speaking about primarily. And it's good to know that you came on board pretty early because it is not only is it a really important film in terms of the story of the real life people involved or part of that, but there's a lot of emotions in that story, right? Not just
Yes.
about being in the Korean War or pilots.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of personal connections. So maybe talk about that because you were inspired, like you said, from the
Yes.
beginning.
Yes. So, the scene in the script that just really just stuck with me so hard was, when Tom purposefully crashes his plane to save
Mm,
Jesse.
mm-hmm.
So the first theme that I wrote, JD and I call it the devotion theme because it's like the
Mm.
heart of devotion, and the cue itself is called "Measure of a Man,"
Mm-hmm.
and it was inspired by what does it mean to be a man who could truly be dependent upon,
Mm-hmm.
truly, a lifetime of service, dependability, devotion,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah, that first theme is what came about. And so throughout the process working with JD, it was all about finding the character themes,
Mm-hmm.
and evolving those character themes throughout the film so that we take the journey with the characters musically,
Right.
kind of like an allegory, in
Right.
in in tandem to the visuals. um
Which,
so yeah.
sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I think you're right because I noticed that some stories, sometimes it can be that the music has to propel the story because maybe it's not on the script as much. But in this
Mhm.
case, it's the reverse where, there is so
It
much
was
there that
there.
it was
Yes.
seamless, I guess, for you in that sense.
Yes. Yes.
And I read somewhere, I think it might have been one of the interviews you did recently, where the director J.D. Diller also told you that he didn't really want a traditional type of
Yes.
score.
Exactly. Yeah.
For people who may be not as familiar or are curious like myself, what would you consider something traditional in film scoring?
So I would say, and this is the film that JD actually said was, I
Mhm.
don't want another Saving Private Ryan.
Okay.
You know, um, Incredible score. It's the
Of
gold
course.
standard. The
Of
gold
course.
standard, obviously. But we wanted to do our own thing.
Yes, of course. Yes.
So yeah, that's really where the conversation started, when they started shooting and I started getting dailies and seeing
Mm,
visuals and things like that. It was like, what is the devotion sound like? When people hear the soundtrack, they know it's this film, Devotion. um
right.
and so
And
that's what
nothing.
JD wanted.
Yeah.
And so there was no temporary scores. So for people who don't know, a temporary score is, when a music editor comes in and they'll put music cues from other movies that already exist to kind of
Right.
help with pacing and to start the conversation with music.
Hmm.
um, JD didn't want that. He was like, I want to hear what comes from your brain.
Right. Like the
and we'll go
original.
and we'll go from there. Yes, and we'll go from there.
Right.
So it was
Okay.
very cool.
Yeah, that's very cool and no pressure, right?
But it felt really liberating
Oh,
because
nice.
it's like, I mean, I can go either way. I do like music, especially in situations where you have to work really, really fast. And
Yes.
you don't have time to experiment. So it's a
Hmm.
shorthand for communicating musical
Oh,
ideas.
right.
But in
Hmm.
this case, I mean, I was there since the script, so I could just play and
That's nice.
do whatever I wanted, really.
Yes,
So,
yes, absolutely. And it shows, right? Because I mean, I've been privy to seeing the film, but I also have been privy to hearing the music on its own.
mhm.
There's a few pieces that I really love, but one that really sat with me as I kind of listened to it, just the music on its own is Hagaru.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
there's just so much in that, right? I don't want
yeah,
to give away the plot because people should see
yeah,
the film. People
yeah.
should really see this film, especially in the big theater with, big sound. But can you talk about your inspiration for the cues? Because I know that
Mhm.
you already mentioned one of my favorite composers, Shostakovich, who a lot of people love, I
Yes,
think.
yes, yes,
Um, there's something, Prokofiev is another one that I always think about when I think of
yes,
epicness, right?
yes, yes.
Um, but you also use some modern influences. So you will have some jazz and some, like, I think you
Yeah,
also mentioned EDM somewhere. So
absolutely.
talk about that mix of, influence.
So, Hagaru is a perfect example of, the influence from Krzysztof Penderecki,
Mm,
totally.
mm-hmm,
So, Threnody to the victims of Hiroshima, an amazing work that I heard in college and stuck with me forever
mm-hmm,
because it's like an orchestra can sound like anything.
right.
It
Mm-hmm,
can really be a sound effects machine. And
absolutely.
so, like, for, Hagaru, like, it's chaotic battle, but you literally hear bombs dropping.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The strings are doing, like, bombs
Yes.
dropping. And so,
I got chills.
so yeah. So, there's just a plethora of orchestral techniques, that you can
Mm-hmm,
glean from the great, classical composers.
right.
Bela Bartok was also a big influence. I mean, growing up playing in orchestras, I played all those pieces. I played
Of
Shostakovich, I
course.
played, Prokofiev, classical symphony. I played, um, Bartok concerto for orchestra and things like that. So you get familiar with
Mm-hmm,
the technique and what the orchestra sounds like, and
right.
that has only served me, in film scoring.
Which makes
And
sense.
so, yeah, and then jazz,
Mm-hmm.
so I did not grow up a jazz musician, but I grew up in church.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of fusion of jazz and gospel, and
Mm,
R&B. Like, so those tonalities, you just grow up hearing, you know,
of course.
stacked chords, almost used like a Bach chorale, those were just influences that I heard, like, growing up. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, and I also love a lot of the great, modern jazz composers like Gunther Schuller,
Mm-hmm.
and let's not forget, Duke Ellington.
Right, right.
Like,
Absolutely.
so a lot of that,
Mm-hmm.
influenced like my harmonic writing.
Right. Okay.
So jazz. So think of, like, Shostakovich with jazz harmonic writing. Even though he did do that in his
I
jazz,
was gonna
he
say,
did do a
I
jazz.
was gonna
A jazz.
say.
Don't worry, I have not forgotten.
You're
But
right.
but a little bit more on the blues side. A
Yes,
little bit more,
absolutely, absolutely.
And so, yeah, those were big influences.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also, like, you know electronic dance music. So
Mm-hmm.
super into, like, I was a 90s kid growing up, like, blasting techno
I know.
in my car, driving a little too fast. And I
Exactly.
loved Gabber, especially because it had these hardcore beats that, like,
Mm-hmm.
just really hit in your speakers. And so, it's just like the culmination of all the things that I love. It's like that's what the
Right.
devotion score wound up being.
That's
It was
that's really
truly my
great.
personality. So
That's really great though, because like you said, it allowed you to play too, right?
Mhm,
As much as a
mhm.
story can have, the story of devotion has a lot of layers, and some of them are sad or dark, and
Exactly.
there's a lot of love and camaraderie too.
Yeah.
So it kind of made sense that you would probably pull from different sources.
Yeah.
Um, I love the use of synthesizers in
Yes.
film scoring too. There's also, as you mentioned, that music can really do a lot of like effects as well for a
Yes.
film. I love how you mixed sounds, like the music stuff, with regards to the planes and the sound of
Mhm.
the planes in the film. And I think, what are they called, these planes? Corsair planes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They have a
Yeah.
very particular sound, these older machines. Can you
I
talk a little bit
do.
about that, that those pieces of,
Yeah, definitely. That was definitely something that JD and I specifically spoke about, like
mhm,
emulating the sounds of Corsairs,
mhm,
and Bearcats. And
mhm,
so, these propeller planes had just these rumbling engines,
mhm,
you know,
yes,
that 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 it's really exciting. There's something about it, like it like moves you. The sound waves of these planes like move
mhm,
you. And so, I wanted to emulate that in the orchestra as well. And so it was a combination of very powerful low brass,
mhm,
emulating the sounds of like these engines on kind of thing.
yes,
and and combining it with synth sounds that
right,
like brought out the bottom, so
mhm,
so it like sat very heavy, um
mhm,
heavy in the score, so as if you're actually feeling like one of
right,
these planes
mhm,
goes by you, or you're like riding in it.
mhm,
And then there's other like I like, for example, in the queue, the lighthouse,
mhm,
towards the end of it, you've got like bouncing strings and winds that are like, it I was kind of like emulating pistons, like perpetual
right,
motion machine, and
mhm,
then also combining that with some more bouncing synthesizers that are more like orchestral colors
right,
than so much like synths for the sake of synthesizers.
right, right,
So
right,
yeah, it was just all of those sounds combined. Just like I said, it's like I like to think of like film scoring as allegorical.
mhm,
It's the musical version of what we're seeing
on
and feeling
screen.
on
Mhm.
screen. So
Yeah, for
yeah.
sure. Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that too because it also mixes really well with the sound design in the
Yeah.
film,
Yeah.
especially with war films. We know how sound design and obviously sound effects are major. And you
Yes.
don't, and sometimes it can take away from beautiful music. So I wanted to know if you were also involved in that process of, you know, um, with
Well,
the not maybe
yeah.
necessarily sound design, but more like you knew your cues and where they were going to go and
Yes.
sort of what they were thinking in terms of sound design.
Exactly. So I kind of okay. So I also have a little bit of sound design background. I worked for a sound company right
Mhm.
out of USC. So, you know,
Okay.
I kind of think of music and sound as working together, like in
Hmm.
lockstep. So
Right.
when I see a scene that, clearly is going to have a lot of sound design, I want to be cognizant of that and think
Hmm.
about like, okay, this is going to be a huge explosion. So let me make sure I don't do anything musically here,
Right.
maybe do something right before or right after,
Hmm.
kind of like you're ducking ducking the sound effect.
Right.
Um, so there was a lot of that going on, and then in a lot of the we would have a few pre-mixes and things like that, and I would get more and more like official sound design elements, and I would get, okay, so they're doing this, so I'm on the right track, so let me make sure I
Oh,
tailor it a
nice.
little bit better.
Okay.
um,
Yeah.
and yeah, and that was the process. So
Very cool. Very
uh,
cool. Because I recently, well, not just recently, but even in the last year, I've had discussions with friends who are like, is it just us or is like the sound sometimes doesn't align with like volume with music, like the music and the actual sound effects. And sometimes you're like, and the music is taking you one way,
yeah, yeah,
right? And then
yeah,
the sound can come in and kind of take you away from that moment. So
yeah,
I
yeah.
appreciated that about devotion in that it worked really nicely together without kind of breaking the connection from
Thank
the
you. We
audience
we worked
perspective.
hard on it.
It shows. It shows. It shows. So tell me in terms of, you obviously wrote for orchestra. Like how many musicians were involved in terms of the whole
So
scoring?
yeah, for this score, there were a total of 109 musicians, including myself, because I played, some solo string effects and stuff like that as well.
Okay.
So yeah, 109 total.
Hmm.
We recorded in Nashville,
Oh, okay.
and we did a technique that's called striping. So we
Hmm.
recorded different sections of the orchestra on different days, so
Oh,
that we could have perfect mix control over the
wow.
orchestra. I think that also um, helped with working with the sound design,
Right.
because there was more control over all of the elements,
Mhm.
so if the sound design, needed, maybe they only wanted the brass to be more prominent and they wanted another piece to be just a slightly less, they had the ability to do that in the final
Right.
dub. So
Right.
it was more tailoring, you know,
Mhm.
was able to be done that way. So
Would you say that's a bit of a luxury
absolutely.
in story?
Absolutely.
Because I
The
know
story.
that you mentioned sometimes you don't have time, right? So,
Yes.
I
Yes.
mean, I love hearing all this stuff behind the scenes because it's like it sounds like when you do have the luxury of time, not just
Mm-hmm.
resources, but I think it's also time, right?
Yes.
Then you can kind
Yes.
of get it to where I'm sure there are people who will say it's never perfect, but
But you can get it pretty darn
you can
close
get it
when,
close to what you
yeah.
think
Yeah.
is real for you, right?
Yes.
And for
Yes.
the audience, as I said, because I have sat in the theater with the film and I was talking about it to a couple of friends afterwards. So um, very cool. So you still play instruments?
Yes,
Do
definitely.
you
Yeah.
do you do you still perform? Because sometimes playing for scoring is one thing, but do you still perform a little bit or?
So actually, the last time I performed was, I think, right before I got pregnant. So it's been a few years. My
Yeah.
son is 5 now, so if
Wow.
that's like any sort of indication. Um, I played, well, when I first moved to LA, I played with a lot of orchestras, like substituting,
Mm-hmm.
and I played with LA Chamber Orchestra as a sub, and San Bernardino Symphony and stuff like that. And and my last performing gig was with the Southeast Symphony, conducted by Anthony Parnther. And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, but I haven't been performing much lately. I'm pretty sure it's just motherhood and then the pandemic.
Of course,
It
yeah.
kind of like just sidetracked me a bit. And then even before that, like just beyond orchestral performance, I played in a band as well,
Oh, nice.
like a LA indie shoegaze,
Yeah.
like
I was gonna
my
say, like,
yeah.
like you said, you grew up in the 90s. There's a lot of influences of sound
Yes, yes.
between, 80s and 90s, well, all the decades, but
Hmm.
I feel
Hmm.
like 90s had a very interesting sound.
Yes.
So, when you're not composing or playing at home, practicing, what are your go-tos?
Oh,
What's on your playlist?
playing video games.
Ah,
Playing with my son, cooking food and playing video games. Those
nice.
are that's life.
That's the
That's
slice of
baseline
life.
life. So it's good.
Yeah, it's a good balance, right? Of,
Yes.
you know, well, your work sounds like play sometimes, so I'm a little bit jealous.
Uh,
Very nice. So yeah, that second part of the question was, what are you listening to as well these days? What's keeping
mm,
you engaged?
I listen to everything, first of all. And I do mean everything. Like
Mhm.
one of the things that my son and I love to listen to on Google is Ryukyu music. So it's Japanese, like Okinawan,
Mhm.
classical,
Yeah,
Japanese classical, but Southern. It's different from
right,
traditional Japanese classical.
right.
And so yeah, stuff like that. And also like listen to Polynesian music, like
Yeah.
like Polynesian chants and things like that. Like um I'm super into Bollywood, so like I love Bollywood soundtracks. AR Rahman is like super awesome.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm all over the place, and then like I'm
Nice.
super into like the stuff that the new kids are doing in EDM, which is like future bass and all this stuff. And like
Right.
the
Yeah.
Porter Robinson, I love a lot. And so, yeah, it's really all over the place. And then
Yeah,
of
which
course
is,
there's KUSC, in the midst of all of this, so
yeah.
classical, of course, but
Of course. Yeah, I think for someone like you who've grown up in that world, I think that's almost like second nature, right?
yeah, yeah, I just listen to
Which,
everything.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
listening to everything, which I think it's awesome. Um, I wanted to ask as much, devotion is now out to the world and hopefully more people will experience it. Um, maybe I missed it in some of my information, but is the music going to be available on platforms as well?
Yeah, it's already out. It
Okay,
came out
nice.
on the 18th, so it is
Okay,
available on all platforms. You name it,
nice.
Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music, all of it.
Perfect.
So yeah, give it a listen.
Yeah, I'll be sure to link it to my to the site
Yes.
when people are listening to this. Thank you so much. It's so amazing to hear
Yeah.
about your work. I could keep asking you questions. For people who are curious about your work in general, Shanda, where can they find you?
Well, you can visit chandadancy.com. That's pretty easy. And then like, there's hours of music on Spotify of like, others, independent films that I've worked on and things like that. Um, and follow on Instagram. I might post like a secret listening link,
Nice.
so it's yeah.
Those nuggets.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Anything else that you want to share, or any kind of projects that you can alert us to, but maybe not give too much away yet?
Yeah, well, I can tell you about next month, the next project coming out is I Want to Dance with Somebody,
Hmm.
the Whitney Houston biopic. So I think that's December 23rd. It's
Hmm.
when that's released. So yes, please go see that too.
Yes.
It's awesome.
Um,
It's
of
Whitney.
course. Oh man, that would be like a whole other conversation.
Yes, I know.
All right, I'm looking forward to that for sure. That's
Awesome. Yeah.
huge. That's a huge one. I've seen some of the trailers, so yeah, it's
Hmm.
looking pretty cool. Excellent. Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you again.
Yeah, same here.
And we'll be in touch hopefully on Instagram.
All right. Yes, please. All right.
Thank you. It's a
Have a good
pleasure.
one.
You too.
Bye.